Hi, I'm Vivienne Wilson. I'm a patient trials advocate with Make Seconds Count, and I'm a real supporter and advocate of clinical trials for patients with secondary breast cancer. So the Patient Trials Advocate Service is the first of its kind with Make Seconds Count. It's for patients with secondary breast cancer who are wanting to find out more about clinical trials and potentially to let us help you find maybe suitable trials that are available for patients anywhere across the UK. So to use the service, the Patient Trials Advocate Service is on the Make Seconds Count website. Quite easy to navigate. So it's in our support section and it's also in our research section. So once you go onto that, you can read a little bit about the service, and there's a button at the bottom that you click on, and it's a booking form. And on that form, we ask for a little bit of information to help us to help you. So it asks us things like your type of breast cancer that you have, whether it's ER positive or HER2 positive, triple negative. If you have any genetic changes, that's useful to know as well. And a little bit about your treatment history, ideally. And that will enable us to do a search for you and narrow down the information that's available on the databases, so we can find things that are potentially suitable for you that you can take to your doctor and have a discussion about trials with. When we receive the form, once the patient has completed the form, they will then be directed to a calendar system where they book an appointment to speak to myself or any of the other two patient trials advocates, and that's Melanie Tolson or Catherine Graham. So one of us will pick up that appointment and we'll call the patient at that allocated time and we'll have a conversation about trials. And we really direct the call to what they want. So we have a conversation about trials at your level of understanding, answer questions that you might have that you don't have the answer to, or reasons that you maybe are put off by going into a trial. So we answer any of those. And also, if it's appropriate, we can then go on to do a search for a study based on the information that you've given us. So when we do a search for patients, we use a number of databases that are available across the UK. And they can be a bit of a minefield if you don't have the knowledge and the understanding of some of the terminology. But we're all very experienced research nurses, so we have that knowledge and expertise to be able to look at the databases, to use the information that the patients have given us to then eliminate studies that aren't appropriate or studies that could be appropriate. Now, we don't have a patient's medical records, so we're going on the information that a patient gives us, but based on that information, we can really narrow down that search. So it can be quite complicated, but once you know what you're doing, and with our medical knowledge and experience that we have, we can soon relatively quickly do that. And we return a report to our patients. We usually turn that round very quickly, within a few days. And if a lady has, or a gentleman has an appointment with, in the near future, we'll escalate that and make sure that is done as a matter of urgency and get that report back to a patient. And the patient receives the report by email, and that's as far as we take that, unless the patient comes back to us with any further questions. So they will say, take that information. It's quite useful to print that information off the report, and they take that to their clinician for a discussion about trials. Some trials are available to patients in their local hospital. However, there is an opportunity for patients, if there's nothing going on in their hospital, there could be a clinical trial a little bit further away, and patients may be prepared to travel, and they may receive a potentially beneficial drug. So it could be a good idea to do that. So we will, when we have a conversation with the patient, they'll give us an idea of how far they're prepared to travel. And very often patients will say, depends what the drug is, it depends how intense the trial is, how frequent I might have to go somewhere else. So it depends. But it's about giving patients information to enable them to make a choice, to have that information that they can make an informed opinion. And sometimes patients receive lots of information about trials and they still continue to go with the standard of care therapy. And that's fine, but they've had that option, they've had that opportunity to consider something, and they can weigh up the pros and the cons. But for some patients, certainly spoken to a lot of patients so far, and certainly hearing now from patients who are going into trials, which is lovely to hear. And they've made that decision having some information and being able to make that decision with the help of their consultant, because none of this is possible without their doctor's help. So there are lots of myths with clinical trials. Lots of patients that I speak to have lots of misunderstandings, and they're very common. Occasionally you'll hear patients saying, they don't want to feel like a guinea pig. Hopefully, I've never in my whole experience had a patient feel anything but hugely supported and grateful for being in a clinical trial. So it's unusual to hear of patients talking about feeling like a guinea pig, but there are lots of myths. Placebos are a common myth. People worry about receiving a placebo or receiving a trial treatment that we don't know enough about, and therefore their care will be compromised. And the one thing I would say there is, your care is always going to be given by a specialist doctor. They are the ones that know the detail about your cancer and whether a trial treatment is appropriate or not. And care is not compromised. Care usually is enhanced. Placebos are occasionally given. They tend to be given when it's in addition. So you're receiving maybe a standard of care treatment, but we're maybe thinking about introducing an additional drug. So perhaps a number of patients will receive that drug, and some people will receive the placebo, but everybody still receives the standard of care treatment. So care isn't compromised. But what I would say, if somebody's thinking about trials, even remotely considering them, get the information about the trial that you are thinking about or your clinician is thinking about. Read the information. Every study comes with an information sheet. So read that information and find out and ask questions. Your consultant wouldn't put you forward for something if they didn't think it was appropriate. And that's why you need the care and support of your consultant. But the Patient Trials Advocate Service enhances that and supports that to enable you to have those conversations with your consultant and feel more empowered to have discussions about clinical trials. So it's really helpful when patients complete the Patient Trials Advocate form to give us as much information as they possibly can, especially if they would like us to do a search for them. If they're just looking for a general conversation about trials, they don't need to give us too much information because we can discuss all of that on the phone anyway. But if somebody's looking for something specific, or if somebody has a particular genetic alteration in their system that they know about, it's really helpful to know about that, because when we do our search, we're looking for subtypes of cancer. So if somebody's ER positive, HER2 positive, triple negative. But now, because of the advancements of medicine, there are a lot of patients who also have genetic changes. And there are some studies, not many, not masses in my experience that I've found so far, but there are a few studies with some genetic changes that might be appropriate as well. So the advice I would give to anybody thinking about trials is now's the time to ask. Think about trials now. It might be that you don't go into a trial for quite some time, or you might go into a trial as a next line of therapy. What I would say is keep your options open with regards to trials. There are clinical trials potentially available to patients, men and women, at every line of therapy in your secondary cancer treatment pathway. It might be that you have to travel a decent distance. It might be that the eligibility criteria restricts certain people, certain treatments might be an exclusion, but consider trials now. Put them into your thought. Think about trials as a potential treatment option for you. Have that discussion with your doctor, see what they say, and take it from there. So some patients worry about feeling well enough to take part in a clinical trial. And when patients have had lots of lines of therapy and may have a slightly impaired quality of life, travelling a significant distance for a clinical trial might not be an option. But again, it's about keeping your options open, finding out what's out there and seeing if that's something that you might be well enough to participate in. Something to consider definitely if you're well enough, or you may decide actually to stay at home nearer to your local hospital and have treatment there. But I would never rule clinical trials out. There are patients who we've looked after who have been, have exhausted all standard of care treatments and have gone on to a clinical trial and done well with that treatment. So never rule them out would be my advice. Being on a clinical trial is extremely safe. Patients who are on clinical trials are monitored extremely closely. As an experienced research nurse looking after patients in early phase studies, I have experience of monitoring our patients so closely. If anything happens, we're there. Clinical trials give drug treatments to patients with cancer, and really in so many ways it's no different to receiving your cancer treatment in the day unit. Those drugs are very toxic, and patients can react to standard of care treatment no differently to being in a clinical trial. So the people who are caring for patients that are on a clinical trial are extremely experienced, very knowledgeable, know lots of information about the drug, how it works, what to expect, what to anticipate. The experts are there, ready for anything that happens. And if it's a drug that we don't know very much about, the drug is given in very, very small amounts and only increased when we know it is safe to do so. So we start with tiny amounts of drug and just bring that up very, very gradually until we find a dose that is appropriate and has a therapeutic effect for our patients. So patients are very, very safe.